Welcome back. As you can see, I've got one of the larger boards that I have. This is not the largest board that I have either. But at any rate, you've got the Minnesota North Stars, the Vancouver Canucks, the Boston Bruins, and the Dallas Stars. And the reason that they're in that order is because the Minnesota North Stars, I became a fan back in 1981. They went all the way to the Stanley Cup final. They lost against the Islanders in a final that I really enjoyed watching. And Minnesota became the team that I kind of adopted that year. Plus, I then met Kevin Maxwell, who was a member of that team that went to the final. He autographed a pennant that I had. My mother bought it for me at the store. He signed it when we were taking it out. It was a little meet and greet that he had just down the street from me. So that went up on my wall when I was a kid, and it was there for a long time. And that's where my fandom of the Minnesota North Stars came from. In 1982, the Canucks go all the way to the final, which really solidified my spot on their bandwagon. So look at that, little kid, and I'm jumping on bandwagons. It's kind of how it works when you're a little kid, though. So the Vancouver Canucks broke my heart in 1982. However, I was a fan. I had seen Canuck games, obviously, before 82. But that's where it really became a thing. Now, with the Boston Bruins, it was the Cam Neely trade that made me say, all right, I'm a Bruins fan. Now, before that, I had, on some level, liked the Bruins. I remember liking Pete Peters. I was a big fan of Ray Bourque. I liked Rick Middleton, Terry O'Reilly. Like, there were members of the team that I liked. But the Boston Bruins, I became a real fan 87, 88, and they went all the way to the final and lost. So there's a pattern here, isn't there? But I thought it would be fun to put this together, and I mean, not fun for me, but fun for people watching this. I mean, on some level, it is entertaining looking back. The Dallas Stars, of course, come in, and we'll get to that, but I want to talk about the Minnesota North Stars first, and I have combined the records for some of the stats I have on the board here because I do consider the Stars to be an extension of the Minnesota North Stars. So 1981, they lose that final in 4 games to 1, and the only ones that I've got on the board are basically series where teams that I cheered for lost in the conference final or the Stanley Cup final itself. Those ones feel more heartbreaking, more frustrating. And so 81 was frustrating. 84, they lost in the conference final against Edmonton in 4 straight. No surprise, none. While the Minnesota North Stars were a very good team in the 80s, at least on paper, they weren't necessarily great on the ice. Usually, they were one of those teams that people would say, all right, the North Stars are kind of due, and then they'd fumble it during the regular season. Of course, in 1991, they lost the Stanley Cup final against Pittsburgh. That series went to 6. I don't know how that went to 6. Go look at the stats from 1991. Look at the numbers for Pittsburgh and look at the numbers for Minnesota. The North Stars just got hot at the exact right time, and anybody who wants to complain about certain teams getting into the final, they don't belong there. They didn't belong there. The Minnesota North Stars kind of embodied that in 1991. They were the ultimate underdogs. So their playoff record from 81 through 1990 was 35 and 39. So below 500, even though they get to the conference final once and the Stanley Cup final in 81. Of course, 91 wouldn't count towards that. That counts towards this decade down here. So that's where it gets a little bit murky. The regular season record from 80 to 90. So from 80 to 90, meaning from the 80-81 season to 89-90 season, they were 12th of 21 teams in the league, right around the mushy middle there. Now, March 10th of 1993, the team gets moved. Norm Green moved the team to Dallas. He became a villain in Minnesota. But I'm going to say this. There was poor attendance. They were in a not very good building either. Nobody locally wanted to buy the team. Norm Green was kind of up against it. And then what that did was it gave Minnesota a chance as a market to find a building, to find an owner, and to make it work. And now the Minnesota Wild have been around for over 20 years, and they've done a pretty good job of making it work in terms of making money, having a really good building. The success on the ice has been a little more elusive, but the Minnesota North Stars, again, 12th to 21, right around middle of the league. Last I looked, if you look at a 10-year rolling average with Minnesota, they're very often around middle of the league as well. So that brings us to Vancouver. Of course, they lose in the Stanley Cup final in 82. They lose in the Stanley Cup final in 94. They did not have a conference final appearance. In fact, they have never lost in the conference final. They haven't been in the conference final other than years they've gone to the Stanley Cup final. They lose in the final in 94 and 7, and in 2011 they lost against Boston in 7. You'll notice that's in blue instead of black, because I felt like that wasn't as much heartbreaking as it was just frustrating. That Stanley Cup final between Boston and Vancouver One I was so excited about going in, and of course, just it got ugly right away. A lot of the sniping, these the fan bases were doing one another, and the team on the ice was as well. It just wasn't fun. I did not enjoy that Stanley Cup final at all, and it's too bad because I felt like this is the one time I'm going to have where I don't care who wins. I'm just going to enjoy this, although I'd rather Vancouver wins. And then, yeah, at home, Vancouver got wins in 3 out of 4, but in Boston, they looked lost. So when we look at the playoff record for Vancouver from 81 through 90, they were 16 and 22. Remember, 11 of those 16 wins came in 82. 91 through 2000, they were 35 and 37. 2001 to 2010, 29 and 36 in the playoffs. From 2011 to 2020, 28 and 29. From 2021 until now, they're 7 and 6 because that was the record they put up in this year's playoffs. So this is the first decade they've been above 500 in the playoffs. It doesn't feel like it. But this is a team that has had their struggles. In the regular season, they like being 17th. From 80 through 90, so this is from 80-81 to 89-90, 17th out of 21 teams. So not great. 90 through 2000, they were 17th of 28 teams. 2000 through 2010, they were 10th out of 30 teams, so pretty heady territory there. From 2011 to 2020, they were 17th out of 30 teams. And from 2021 to 2024, so including this season, they're 20th out of 32 teams. So they had a very good season, yes, but you can see, and this is why I've said they've never had that sustained success. Outside of 2010 through, 2000 through 2010, where they're 10th out of 30 teams, that's not really elite. And that's the thing, Vancouver's never really had that big elite run. What's interesting, too, is their playoff record from 81 till now sits at 115 to 115 wins, 130 losses, 17th. Vancouver likes being 17th. How many teams make the playoffs? There's your problem. So they need to expand the playoffs to 17 teams and call it the Canucks spot. But then we get to the Boston Bruins. The Boston Bruins lose in the 1988 final in 4 straight to an Edmonton Oilers team that was great. 1990, they lose in the Stanley Cup final against an Oilers team I felt like Boston should have been able to beat. That took 5 games. Boston won the President's Trophy that year, too. So there you go. 1991, they go to the conference final. They lose in 6 games against Pittsburgh. The last time that I ever got hockey was when it looked like Boston was going to beat Pittsburgh, and then they didn't. 1992, in the conference final again, they lost against Pittsburgh in 4 straight. Then in 2011, they win the Stanley Cup, meaning from 92 to 2011, I didn't really have a lot to talk about with Boston. And that Stanley Cup, again, tainted a little bit by the fact that I was really cheering for Vancouver, so... And I couldn't really wear Boston jerseys in public without... Canuck fans weren't very nice about me wearing that jersey at all. So, 2013, the Bruins get back to the final against Chicago. Chicago beats them in 6. 2019, Boston gets to the final. They lose against St. Louis in 7. So lost in the final, lost in the final, lost in the final, lost in the final. There's a pattern here. And again, you could always tell somebody, hey, the one time Boston beat a team in the Stanley Cup final since 1972, it was the Canucks. And you could really punch that in there. And as a Canuck fan, I can't argue with that statement. I want to be able to say, hey, this is an elite franchise, but the overall numbers say not really. In the playoffs from 81 through 90, Boston 47 and 52. From 91 to 2000, 34 and 45, and they went through some stuff during the 90s. It was a shame. I always felt that Ray Bourque had to win that Stanley Cup in Colorado. It just to this day doesn't sit well with me. I really wish he'd won a Stanley Cup in Boston. Fine that he won one in Colorado. I just wish Boston could have won one for him. From 2001 to 2010, Boston 23 and 26 in the playoffs. From 2011 till 2020, 67 and 54. So there's a positive record. And since 2021, 18 and 20. So below 500 in the playoffs since 2021. And again, the one decade they were above 500 in the playoffs, which means they've done pretty well. 2011 to 2020, where they have that 2011 Stanley Cup win. Regular season, they were 4th out of 21 teams from 80 to 90. From 90 to 2000, they were 7th out of 28 teams. From 2000 to 2010, 6th out of 30 teams. From 2011 to 2020, 2nd out of 31 teams. And since 2021, they've been first in the NHL in terms of overall standing. Not that it's helped them come playoff time, but they've been the best regular season team. They've missed the playoffs 7 times. I did forget to cover that. Vancouver's missed the playoffs 18 times in the time that I've been watching them. And I just mean since 1981. Boston, 7 playoff misses. They're normally in the playoffs. Playoff record, 189 wins, 197 losses. So overall, they've got the most wins, but they've also got the most losses. That's what happens when you make the playoffs, the most out of the 3 franchises on the board, although playing out of 4 different cities. So for the Dallas Stars, they get to the conference final in 1998, where they lost against Detroit in 6. They couldn't beat Detroit. Detroit was a problem for Dallas. 1999, they won the Stanley Cup, and I remember part of the argument being, well, they didn't have to play Detroit that year. No, they played Colorado. Colorado did Dallas a favor by knocking Detroit out in the previous round. In 2000, Dallas gets back to the Stanley Cup final. They lost against New Jersey in 6, a final series which was a lot of fun to watch. Even though Dallas lost, I was still very proud of them in the end. 2008, they lose in the conference final against Detroit in 6. So even though they're 10 years apart, they still had problems beating Detroit. 2020, they get all the way to the Stanley Cup final, an unexpected run, and they lost against Tampa Bay in 6. 2023, so we're up to last year, they lose in the conference final against Vegas in 6. And this year, they lost in the conference final against the Oilers in 6. Again, I do feel like of the 3 on the board, Dallas is probably best situated to maybe win a Stanley Cup soon. But again, that generally doesn't happen for teams that I root for. Playoffs from 91 through 2000, they go 66 and 48. I don't think that includes any Dallas. I don't think, 91, sure. So that'd take, that's part of the reason they have a 66 and 48 record, because you get all the way to the Stanley Cup final in 91 and you win the Stanley Cup in 99. 2001 to 2010, 25 and 32 record in the playoffs. From 2011 to 2020, 31 and 28. So they don't make the playoffs that often during the 2010s, but when they did, they were pretty good. And that Stanley Cup final runs in there too. Since 2021, they've been 23 and 22 in the playoffs. So just a little bit above 500, which doesn't really matter come playoff time. It's just you win or you lose. Simple. Regular season, they were 6th out of 28 teams from 91 through 2000. That's dragged down a little bit by the records of the Minnesota North Stars before they moved to Dallas. From 2000 till 2010, they were 5th out of 30 teams. 2011 to 2020, 13th out of 31 teams. I put 30 again, it's 31. And they were they're 10th out of 32 teams since 2021 in the overall standings. So, yeah, that's where they're at in that. But at the very least, 10th for Dallas, 1st for the Boston Bruins. They've both had pretty good runs in recent years. Dallas and Minnesota missed the playoffs 14 times in the time that I've been a hockey fan. Their playoff record, 180 wins and 169 losses. So they're the one team that I root for that has a positive postseason record. The Boston Bruins, 8 games below 500, and the Vancouver Canucks, 15 games below 500. So that's where that's at. And if the playoff record gets combined here, 35. Well, no, that's that includes that number. Never mind. I'm trying to correct myself on something I don't need to. Standard. So in terms of nemesis, there are certain nemesis for every team, right? For Boston, it is Montreal. And I know Montreal hasn't been good lately, but 9 times I have watched Montreal knock out Boston, including a bunch of times in the 80s. So, yeah, Montreal was a problem. 3 times Boston's lost against both Florida and the New Jersey Devils, of course. 2 times in the last 2 years against Florida, so Florida's moving up the charts, but they have a long way to go before they're going to get to Montreal. For Dallas, 5 times they've lost against St. Louis. Remarkable, I've never been mad at St. Louis any of the times they've knocked out Dallas. I've been mad at Dallas for losing those series. 4 times Dallas / Minnesota, and / Minnesota with the St. Louis losses as well. 4 times the North Stars and Stars organization have lost against Chicago and Detroit. And then for Vancouver, Calgary's the nemesis. 5 times I've watched Calgary knock out Vancouver. For Chicago, Edmonton, and LA, they're all tied. It's a 3-way tie with 3 times each that they've knocked teams out. including Edmonton getting into this mix this year with knocking out Vancouver in the second round. Twice they've knocked Vancouver out in the second round, and the other time they knocked Vancouver out in the first round. The 2 times they've knocked Vancouver out in the second round, Vancouver was the favorite. Vancouver was the favorite back in, I think it was 92 that they lost. Yeah, it was 92 they lost against Edmonton. 93 they lost against LA. Oh, this is a great stroll down memory lane for me. But yeah, Vancouver's had their struggles with the Alberta teams. That's 8 combined losses between Calgary and Edmonton. And yet, when they've beaten Calgary, they've gone to the 82 Stanley Cup final as well as the 1994 Stanley Cup final. So it did work out pretty well when they knocked out Calgary. But outside of that, it's kind of been a party for Calgary, including 2004 and 2015, the most recent ones for Vancouver against Calgary. So if you wanted to see a misery index from yours truly, I would say in terms of which teams caused me the most misery, it's interesting because you would think that missing the playoffs 18 times with Vancouver, I mean, that's one type of misery, but it does feel like Boston has been close so many times. So many times they've had an elite team. They've had really, really solid front-to-back roster players up front on the blue line and in net. And then in the playoffs, they've just come up short. For Minnesota and then Dallas, more often than not, they were underdogs. When they were favorites in Dallas, they were pretty good. And then since they faded out of that, they've had a couple of pretty good runs there as well, including in the last 5 years, they've had 3 times where they've been in the Final Four. So I do still feel like Dallas is likely to eventually win a Stanley Cup, but we will see. So people talk about the Canada curse and everything. If I qualify as a bit of a curse, I apologize. It sometimes feels like I do. But yeah, so there you go. I thought this would be a fun thing to look at. I had this idea about 3 weeks ago, actually. And I thought, no, I'll wait till Dallas gets eliminated and then I can do the video. So Dallas has been eliminated. Here we are. But let me know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And if you root for any of these teams, I apologize. Because on some level, I feel like it's got to be me, right? It's got to be my fault. Because when teams I root for win the Stanley Cup, there's always people going, well, that deserves an asterisk because, yeah, because my team won it is how I look at it. But at any rate, maybe at some point in time, somehow, some way, I will see a team I root for hold up a Stanley Cup. Normally when that happens, I wake up in a cold sweat going, what just happened? But yeah, it's not something that I've seen. And the funny part too is that with the Vancouver Canucks, anytime I play an NHL EA Sports game, I'm always like, okay, I'm going to play this. I'm going to get them the Stanley Cup. And I'm always really happy I get them the Stanley Cup. And then this profound sadness takes over of, I don't think I'm ever actually going to see them hold the Stanley Cup up. Generally, the rule is I'll run Vancouver and get them a Stanley Cup. Then I run a Boston franchise, get them one, and then Dallas. So I go in order as well, usually. And then I'll just pick a random team from around the NHL and try to get them to the Stanley Cup as well. There you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you guys so much for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.